Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. We have special guest today. Norman Finkelstein is an American political scientist, activist, professor, and author. His primary fields of research are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the politics of the Holocaust. Any interest motivated by the experiences of his parents who were Jewish Holocaust survivors. He's a graduate of Binghamton University and received his PhD in political science from Princeton University. Welcome, Norm Finkelstein. Thanks for being our guest.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, you're an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I just wanted to, most people don't really know the cause of the conflict. They just know that there is a conflict and that the United States is friendly to Israel because they're a democracy, and they're the only democracy in the Middle East, people like to say. So how do you explain this to people who don't really know much about it, which is most of the people in the United States, and they certainly don't know much about it if they watch the TV news. So your average person, I don't think, knows anything really about it. So how do you inform people about that conflict, how it started and what it's about?
I think the most effective way to inform people is by way of analogy. Effectively, what happened to the Palestinian people over the past century is pretty close to what happened to the Native American population in the United States. If you take, for example, the fate of the Cherokee Indians, who originally reside on the eastern coast of the United States, and they were gradually pushed until they ended up in Arkansas, and then they were pushed into a portion of Arkansas, which then once white settlers crowded in that portion, it became Oklahoma. And so the Cherokee were effectively the victims of a policy of expulsion, transfer, if you want to call it, in the Israeli vernacular. And basically, there are obviously differences, and one doesn't want to pretend as if there are no differences. But to look at the big picture, I would say, is not fundamentally different than what happened to the native population in the U.S.
Wow. So that I've never heard it described that way before. That's ironically, I most Americans aren't too aware of how horrible that's a chapter in our history is either. So the United States gives aid and funding, billions of dollars in funding to Israel every year. And people say that Israel is running an apartheid state and that Gaza is an open air prison. Now, are those two things true? And how could that be? How could that be if we're supporting them?
Well, I think both facts are true. Israel both benefits from two facts. Number one, it benefits from the fact that there is a convergence of interests between U.S. ruling elites and Israel on many basic issues. So, for example, right now, there's a convergence of interests between the U.S. and Israel in strengthening Saudi Arabia, strengthening the Gulf, and trying to contain Iran. That's a fundamental convergence of interest, and that in part, probably in the most significant part, it explains U.S. support for Israel. But there is also another factor, and one shouldn't pretend as if that other factor doesn't exist, which is to say there's a very powerful Israel lobby operating in the United States, not unlike the gun lobby, the Cuba lobby. The Israel lobby is another lobby, very effective, probably one of the most, if not the most effective lobbies operating in Washington. And its core component is a very powerful, articulate, and organized American Jewish community. Though even there you have to enter qualifications, because among younger Jews, there's certainly a diminishing of support for Israel. But the big picture is, both because of a convergence of interests and because of a powerful, articulate, organized, strategically placed lobby, a lobby that has a lot of influence in the media, a lot of influence in publishing, a lot of influence in journals of opinion, a lot of influence in Hollywood. That lobby has been a major factor in determining aspects of U.S. policy towards Israel. Now, on the second point, I don't really think it's any longer controversial whether or not Israel is an apartheid state. I don't say this as a polemicist. I'm trying to be objective and dispassionate about the situation. There are between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are roughly now, you could say, about 12 or 13 million people, roughly. Now, that includes the West Bank, it includes East Jerusalem, it includes Gaza. And Israel has controlled the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza. It's controlled it now for more than a half century. And the Israeli government has made it clear that it has no intention whatsoever of returning to the borders from the June 1967 war, that is, pre-controlling West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So we can't any longer talk about an occupation. We have to be talking about an annexation. The territories have been de facto annexed. After a half century, that seems to me to be the reasonable conclusion. There has been a de facto annexation. So of all that population that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, roughly speaking, about half has either second-class status or overwhelmingly no rights whatsoever within the state. No voting rights, and then from there down, they don't even have rights to property. Property can be confiscated overnight at a whim with the support of the courts. So it seems to me, again, trying to be rational, trying to be objective, and trying to be dispassionate, there's no other term to describe a situation in which close to half the population either has second-class rights, that would be within Israel proper, or no rights whatsoever, which would be the West Bank and Gaza. That's an apartheid situation. But again, that shouldn't shock us. You have to remember, I don't know how old you are, but I have a vivid recollection. During the last days of apartheid, Ronald Reagan supported the apartheid regime, as did Margaret Thatcher. They were calling, till the very end, Reagan and Thatcher were calling Nelson Mandela and the ANC, the African National Congress, terrorist organizations. So if our government was, until the very end, at the end of apartheid, if our government was supporting South Africa because it saw it as a bastion of Western, call it civilization, whatever you want to call it, in Africa. So for the same reason, they support Israel in the Middle East.
So you think it's without, because you say it's without question that Israel's an apartheid state, which I agree with. But there are people who question it. People very loudly push back against that, and they quote the numbers of Palestinians. Well, they say there's an Arab political party that's the third largest party in Israel, and that they quote numbers of Palestinians who are allowed to vote. What do you say to those arguments?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you asked the questions, because there's no more effective way to have a discussion than for one of us to play the devil's advocate. In this case, it should be you. First of all, I tried to be clear. I said there's a gradation of rights. In the case of Israel, the Palestinians have second-class rights. Israel has now officially declared that. It declared Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. So I, for example, am Jewish, and if the United States were declared the nation state of the Christian people, I would certainly experience that declaration, especially once it becomes enacted in laws. I would certainly experience that as me being a second-class citizen. That is to say, I don't belong here. It's the state of the Christian people. It's not my state. But having said that, let's keep in mind that that's only one component of the Palestinian population that's under Israeli control, or has been effectively annexed by Israel. The West Bank, people in the West Bank, they don't vote in Israeli elections. They're not represented in the Israeli Knesset. The people in Gaza, they don't vote in Israeli elections. They're not represented in the Israeli parliament, the Israeli Knesset. So for the vast preponderance of Palestinians currently annexed to the Israeli state, they have no rights whatsoever.
Okay.
I don't know how else. The only way you can get around that is by saying that, well, there's a peace process, but the Israeli government has already made clear you'd have to be blinder than King Lear not to see that the Israeli government has said we're not returning to the old borders. Oh, that's a declaration. Once you've made that statement, it's a declaration of annexation. And if it's annexation, then you have to accept that when deciding whether or not Israel is an apartheid state, it can't be limited to Israel and its pre-June 67 border. It's the whole area, including the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including Gaza.